which is in Boston. Well, Waltham, but easier to say Boston. And I'll let the judges introduce themselves in just a minute. Now, I'm supposed to read this, so I'm sure you all have already read it. In this part of the competition, there are 3 parts to the competition. The full presentation, which is 30 minutes. And then tomorrow, there's another part, which is 10 minutes, and then 90 seconds. So there are 3 parts. So in this part of the competition, you are taking on a fictional business identity and assigning a fictional business identity to the judges. So you'll tell us, will you not, who we're supposed to be, whether it's the board of directors or what have you. Now, please make sure everyone knows who you are and who they are, that is us, before you start. You will have 25 minutes plus a 5-minute cushion to describe the legal, financial, and ethical dimensions of the problem, and to recommend a solution that passes muster on all 3 counts. Okay? During this time, teams will be uninterrupted. When you're finished with your 25 to 30-minute presentation, the judges will ask you questions for 20 minutes, if we have enough questions to ask you. I will ask the first question, and then turn it over to the other judges. During the Q&A, both you and the judges stay in character. You know, whoever you tell us you are, stay there. And we will do the same. Come on in. After the Q&A, okay, the judges will give you some feedback on how they felt you did. You know, you did wonderfully, however, or whatever. Some important things to keep in mind. The ethical aspects of your analysis are the most important part, because this is a business ethics competition. However, these should be described in a simple, practical, common sense fashion, meaning that you shouldn't use a lot of technical, philosophical terminology, or basing your argument on religious or theological grounds will be considered a serious weakness to your argument. Like God told me to do this. That probably won't go over. Similarly, any member of the team reading his or her part will also be considered a major mistake. Like this. You should not do what I'm doing. Although you may use notes, you know, to prompt yourself. And during this presentation, every member of the team must have some sort of speaking role. Okay? One person can't just sit there. Got it? All right. Now, you have a timer.
We do.
And do you know how to use it?
Not as a timer, but as a clock.
Okay. What you want to do is to set this. Let's see if I know how to do it. Yeah. Oh, let's clear it. Oh. We need to get into a timer. Where did Tom go when I need him? Oh, good, it's on the side. There you go. 30 minutes. I'll start mine when you start yours, but when it's ready to start, hit that. Any questions so far?
Do we need to do, I just want to make sure as far as the introductions, do we need to be doing that before we get further into it? Because that's, I was curious.
You said you wanted us to introduce ourselves. And
Yeah, I'd like for you to introduce yourselves just quickly, you know, your names, and then go into character.
Okay.
Tell us who you are. Are you a consulting group talking to the board of the company, or are you, I don't know. I don't know who you are. Okay?
We got to meet you guys, but we didn't get to meet you guys.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I'm Allison Howie. Actually, we both work for Industry Corporation. I've been practicing law for over 20 years.
Wow.
I was in the commercial litigation section, but now I'm part of ethics and compliance. And my title is Managing Counsel of Information Governance.
And I'm Kyle Hoffpower with Energy as well. We're the utility company for Louisiana, Mississippi, part of Texas, and Arkansas. And we have some nuclear plants up in the Northeast. And I'm in the ethics and compliance group as a ethics and compliance professional.
It's an interesting field to be an ethics and compliance professional.
Yes, and we're headquartered here in New Orleans, so I think we're probably the only Fortune 500 company here in New Orleans. Sadly.
I'm Ernie Broughton. I'm the director of the MBA and Executive Education programs at St. Mary's University in San Antonio. Also a senior advisor to the Ethics and Compliance Initiative, and formerly Chief Ethics Officer at United Services Automobile Association in San Antonio, USA.
Pretty important people. Okay.
I'm Varnika Singh. We're from Mercer University. We're in the graduate MBA program. I'm doing my Master's of Accountancy and my MBA.
I'm Brandon Monk. I'm in the MBA program at Mercer, and I'll graduate in May.
Brigitte Zaman, MBA at Mercer, and I will graduate next May 2016.
My name is AJ Donaldson, MBA program at Mercer, and I'll be graduating in December.
Okay, ready to start?
Sure.
Okay, when?
Good morning. We are the Mercer Consulting Group, here to discuss the crimes and cover-up of the Emory Eye Clinic. As the judges, you will be acting as the Professional Standards and Ethics Committee. My name is AJ Donaldson. I'll be discussing the background of the case. Brigitte Zaman will be going over the business issues with the case. Varnika Singh will be going over the legal issues with the case. And lastly, Brandon Monk will be going over the ethical issues as well as our recommendations, again, as you are the Professional Standards and Ethics Committee. Dr. Dwight Kavanaugh was an ambitious young ophthalmologist who wanted to build the greatest eye clinic, not only in the Southeast, but in the United States. He was well respected among his peers, and he continued to gain more talent year after year, recruiting at Emory University to grow the business. At a time when Dr. Kavanaugh knew that he needed to get additional funds, he knew that patient surgeries were the key to raise those additional funds to get the necessary grants to continue to grow the business. And not one person or one event would hold him back of his dream. On the evening of September 12, 1983, Dr. Kavanaugh rushed to the operating room. He was about to perform his 13th surgery that evening. 13, that's an unlucky number. Well, you don't have to tell that to Sargis Houston, as Dr. Kavanaugh operated on Sargis Houston's wrong eye. He operated on a healthy eye. And immediately, Dr. Kavanaugh began to cover his tracks, altering patient records. He even convinced Sargis Houston the next day that he meant to operate on his wrong eye, on the healthy eye, that it would help him in the long run. Now this made me think that this may be an isolated incident. It was not. There were 6 other documented cases where Dr. Kavanaugh, again, altered patient records and operated on healthy eyes. There were 2 whistleblowers. Dr. David Campbell and Dr. Alan Gammon, who confronted Dr. Kavanaugh and the Emory leadership, advising that this behavior of Dr. Kavanaugh is not of a well ethical leader. Why would someone continue to hurt patients? Well, both Dr. Kavanaugh and Emory thought that these were just minor speed bumps along with growing the business. To show the power that Dr. Kavanaugh had within the ophthalmology world, especially in Atlanta, a fellow ophthalmologist recommended that one of his patients, a 7-year-old girl, go to see Dr. Kavanaugh, as the ophthalmologist was not sure if she needed surgery. Immediately upon seeing Dr. Kavanaugh, the mother and the child, Dr. Kavanaugh immediately said, "Surgery's a must. Let me get you in touch with my secretary and we'll get you scheduled away next week for the surgery." This was a 7-year-old girl, a child, and a risky procedure for a cornea transplant. Was it really necessary for a 7-year-old to go through this? Her eyes are still maturing. She's still growing. Well, luckily the mother sought a second opinion. Another ophthalmologist in Atlanta told the 7-year-old child and her mother that her eyes were healthy and that surgery was not necessary. This ophthalmologist even said he was surprised that Dr. Kavanaugh even thought about such a risky surgery for a 7-year-old girl. Now, before we get further into the case, I want to leave you with one question to think about as we go through our discussion as the Professional Standards and Ethics Committee. Is this the leader you want leading your organization? Now, Bridget will go over the business issues.
All right. I am the most powerful eye doctor in the world, states Dr. Kavanaugh to his peers, and he may as well have been. He had immense power. The doctor in the white coat was articulate, charismatic, and brilliant. As a chairman at the Emory Eye Clinic, it had given him even more power. He had a vision to build the new eye clinic, and to do that, he personally funded $12 million over the span of 8 years. And for a while, that let him get away with irrational behavior. He saw a life and death struggle to build the $24.5 million eye clinic that was to be world class. And to do that, he used an unethical business model, unlike any other. How did Dr. Kavanaugh raise funds to build the new state-of-the-art eye clinic? First, it was a malpractice. He operated on healthy eyes, told patients they needed surgeries when they did not, and changed medical charts, all to maximize the number of surgeries needed for funds to flow into the new building. He also had misdiagnosis rates awful as 10%, which was not typical, absolutely not typical. Dr. Kavanaugh performed 13 corneal transplants. So just imagine 13. The average surgeon performed 5. And second, how did Dr. Kavanaugh outperform his colleagues? He gave his patients negligent post-operative care. His patients waited for at most 6 hours in the overcrowded waiting rooms just to see Dr. Kavanaugh for only 2 to 3 minutes. He cut corners to generate revenue. Examples included using improper tests on patients. Number 3, Dr. Kavanaugh grew the business through fraud. He billed Medicare for surgeons when fellow residents conducted surgeries. And he also billed for operations that were never performed. Dr. Kavanaugh's used his powers in the wrong ways to exploit patients and to injure lives. He formed a band of followers to conspire and cover up his unethical behavior. And he was still, at that time, driven to build the eye clinic, especially to call it his state-of-the-art eye clinic. As a result, he operated in the wrong eye of Sargus Houston. And when glaucoma appeared, he was neglected. Today, he was completely blind. When Dr. Kavanaugh was caught and sued, he tried to buy loyalty from his colleagues using millions of dollars. Even his peers started to state they refused to work for a sociopath. Dr. Kavanaugh's criminal business model would eventually result to all the lawsuits. Dr. Kavanaugh's criminal business model is a reputational loss. The loss of trust means loss of finest faculty, loss of referrals, loss of patients, and clinic endowment. Is this how you would like for Emory to be viewed? Is this how you would like Emory to be viewed by the public? The impact of harming innocent people is huge. It deteriorates trust and reputation. And therefore, they would still be in the headlines until our committee changes the culture. Imagine a legal feast. What is the total cost of all the lawsuits and the premium attorney fees? Well, a strong company's valuation is goodwill. It should be on the balance sheet for the Emory Eye Clinic as an intangible asset. Without goodwill, the business would not thrive. And goodwill is needed for long-term investment. Lastly, for our public trust, the Emory Eye Clinic should be honest, admit the mistake, fix the problem, and get back to caring for patients ethically. Ethical leaders discern and decide in business ethical problems in ways to enhance justice and trust. We must reposition the business. Therefore, Varnica will speak on behalf of the legal issues.
So far, we have given you some of the background of the incidents that led up to the case. I would now like to give you some of the legal facts concerning the cases. There were 7 patient lawsuits in the aftermath of what happened. Most of those lawsuits were sealed, so we don't have a lot of detail on those. The only lawsuit that was settled publicly was the Sargus Houston lawsuit. In this case, they chose to charge Kavanaugh and Emory University with 5 charges: medical malpractice, fraud, breach of contract, battery, and racketeering. We consulted legal experts who've been working in the Atlanta area since the 1980s, and they believe that it would have been relatively simple to prove the first 4 counts. Dr. Kavanaugh altered patient charts. He lied to his patients, he lied to the insurance companies, and he browbeat his colleagues into lying for him. There was plenty of evidence for the first 4 charges. The last charge, racketeering, is always more difficult to prove than simple malpractice or fraud. This is because it requires proving the involvement of 2 parties, and it requires conviction under 2 separate felony charges. In this case, they chose to charge Kavanaugh and Emory University with conspiracy to defraud and for using the U.S. Postal Service to defraud. The Medicare fraud that happened back in the 1980s was obviously conducted through the mail at some point, but the real implication of this charge is that Emory was complicit in his actions. Despite the evidence that they had, Emory left Kavanaugh as the head of the clinic for years after the incident. Knowing about his behavior and letting it continue makes them complicit. We also believe that it was this last charge that induced Emory to settle both with Sargus Houston and then with the rest of the patients. This is because if they were convicted under racketeering, they would have had to pay 3 times the amount of money damages just as a matter of law. Almost as shocking as what happened to Sargus Houston is what happened to the whistleblowers, Drs. Campbell and Gammon. Drs. Campbell and Gammon were colleagues of Dr. Kavanaugh's at the clinic. They observed his behavior firsthand and they felt that it was their responsibility to report it to the hospital administration. Dr. Campbell began to grow concerned about Kavanaugh's behavior back in 1980. By 1983, before Sergeant Houston's surgery, he had clear evidence of misconduct. He took this evidence to Emory University and he wrote memos to the hospital administration. Dr. Gammon also at the same time protested Kavanaugh's behavior to Emory University. Emory, however, chose to side with the more powerful Dr. Kavanaugh than with the doctors who took a risk by speaking up against him. Doctors Gammon and Campbell suffered retributions at work, but they still continued to protest. But in the end, Emory University forced them out, and they sued Emory for retaliation. Now, lawsuits that involve medical malpractice are generally more expensive to take to trial than most other lawsuits because they tend to be long and they require a lot of expert testimony, which is expensive. In this case, Emory took 14 years to settle the lawsuits. That's 14 years of a drain on resources and a bad reputation. 14 years of hours and hours of depositions and court costs and attorney fees. 14 years of this black cloud hanging over the institution. We don't know what the specific details of what happened with these cases again because they were sealed, but we do know that Emory lost, and we know they had to pay the judgment and the court costs for both sides. In the aftermath, Emory also sued Genevieve Switz. Genevieve Switz was Kavanaugh's physician's assistant at the time of Sergeant Houston's surgery, and she was present for it. She took charts home that contained evidence of medical malpractice and fraud because she was afraid of being used as a scapegoat. Like everyone else who worked for Kavanaugh, she was afraid. And like everyone else who worked for Kavanaugh, she did things out of fear that made her uneasy. Emory's lawsuit was recognized for what it was, and it was this, Emory lost, and they had to make a public apology to Switz. These last three cases are especially instructive for Emory because these last three cases could have been completely avoided. There was a problem. Emory had culpability. It was tempting to close ranks, but that was evidence of short-term thinking. By closing ranks, Emory took something that could have been settled quickly and quietly and turned it into a public debacle. A cover-up always exasperates the crime. We also believe that Emory should have labeled an abnormality, they should have taken corrective action, and they should have made compensation to the patients. We also believe that it's a fiduciary responsibility of the hospital administration to watch for predictive behaviors in their doctors. Factors like the number of surgeries performed and the amount of post-operative time spent with the patients are highly correlated with the possibility of a lawsuit. We believe that by watching for these symptoms that might indicate future problems, Emory University can save money and eyes. Brandon will now further discuss the ethical issues.
Historically, medical ethics has been concerned with physicians' duties. New physicians are required to swear upon the Hippocratic Oath and to uphold specific ethical standards. The first of these is do no harm. It's much better to do very little or even nothing than to risk harming or injuring a patient. At Emory, this historical value was obviously violated. We know the facts in the case. Malpractice and fraud was used to fund the clinic. Healthy eyes were operated on, and records were changed. The clinic knew all of this, but they acted to cover it up. They withheld documents from the American Academy of Ophthalmology and the State Board of Medical Examiners. The actions by Emory and Dr. Kavanaugh are simply wrong. They're unethical, unlawful, immoral, and against anything we might consider to be right. The cause? Emory's culture. Now we understand the Professional Standards and Ethics Committee might believe that if you limit the number of surgeries and limit the number of hours that physicians work, then you might fix the issue that you have. But culture has a big impact on what people do in organizations. And if you don't fix the culture, you won't fix your problem. Emory is concerned with the truth. It's in their vision statement. Think about what's most important to you when you go to the doctor. Is it truth and honesty? Would you go back to a doctor who lied to you? Victor and Cullen categorized these three ethical cultures. Today, Emory has a culture driven by egoism. Their employees act out of self-interest and prestige, sometimes at any cost. Utilitarian ethics might be applicable in some business models, but in medicine, physicians have a duty to each patient, and they don't have any right to distribute care unequally. Emory needs to adopt a duty-based culture, and their employees will be driven by principles and codes. There's 3 key factors that are influencing the culture at Emory. The first is decision making. An irrational leader is making all of the decisions. Patients aren't being given their right to informed consent, and therefore they can't make their own decisions. Employees are fearful of the leader, and they're blindly obedient to him. They've rationalized their behaviors and contribute to the unethical actions that are taking place. Rewards are being given for the number of surgeries, and this is providing the wrong incentive. Rewards should be given for positive patient outcomes. There's no justice at Emory. The 2 whistleblowers, Dr. Campbell and Dr. Gammons, have brought forth these allegations of unethical behavior, and nothing's been done about it. For Emory to have organizational justice, there needs to be 3 factors. They need to have trustworthy leadership, a perception of fairness, and procedural justice. There's over 300 studies that support the fact that organizational justice provides better results. This is a very strong statement. Today, first, we recommend that you settle quickly and quietly with patients. This will help you avoid the threat of RICO charges, and therefore your settlement costs will be much lower. You should also develop a story around the 2 whistleblowers so that other employees have an incentive to act in the way that they did. You should fire Dr. Kavanaugh and hire an ethical leader, review all of Dr. Kavanaugh's charts, and make sure that no other patients require compensation. You should also add to the peer review process an ethics committee. Now, as you move forward to try to get Emory's culture back in the right direction, the first thing you need to do is draft a standards of ethical conduct, but have physicians take part in this. They need to have a part in drafting the process. Next, you need to start ethics training and make sure that top management's involved. Begin surveys and audits so that you can track changes in the culture over time. And appoint a compliance committee. This is for accountability. They appoint directly to the president and the CEO. Also, you need to develop and maintain a hotline for whistleblowers. They undergo dissent and many psychological issues, and they deserve to be protected. And lastly, start a response and investigation system so that you have fair and open procedures when allegations of unethical behavior are brought forward. And now we'll turn it over to AJ, and he'll close it out.
In conclusion, we've gone over the business, the legal, and the ethical issues with this case. With the business issues, reputation is huge. It can go away in seconds. And being a referral business, you don't want to have a bad reputation. With the legal issues, 14 years of dealing with attorneys and legal fees. Is it proper for your operation to have doctors take 2 to 3 hours of their day to be meeting with attorneys, to do depositions, when they should be going back to their primary care of caring for the patient? And lastly, with the ethical issues. With the principles duty base, we believe that by changing the culture and removing Dr. Kavanaugh, then you can remedy these problems quickly and quietly and move the ophthalmology department in a better direction. As the Professional Standards and Ethics Committee, you cannot afford another Emory patient to wake up blind. Never again. Thank you for hearing our presentation, and at this time we'd be glad to answer any questions you have about the case.
Thank you, AJ. I'm going to reset my clock. You're well within your time limit to 20 minutes if you'd like to do the same. Or you don't have to, I'll let you know.
Clear.
Okay, shall, you got it?
Sorry.
No, that's all right. I mean, I can't believe I actually did this. I'm not very good at it. Okay.
Right there with
Well,
you.
huh?
I said I'm right there with you.
Let me start the questions. As a, the Professional Standards and Ethics Committee of the university, I'm shocked to hear all these facts come before us. It's not the first time that we've heard rumor of this, but I'm wondering, do you think this is, you mentioned medical ethics. Is this a medical ethics problem, or is this a business ethics problem? And how do you distinguish between those two? I mean, in the hospital, we have a medical ethics committee that makes some very difficult decisions about cloning and, euthanasia and all sorts of medical ethical issues. But is this a medical ethical issue, or is this something more as a business ethical issue?
Well, the way that I have always differentiated between the two is that business ethical issues always involve a little bit of money. They kind of tell you the impact that it might have on your business as far as money. And with Kavanaugh, especially consider, so some of the stories that we heard, a lot of the ophthalmologists in the community were passing on these stories. I mean, wouldn't you, if you heard a story about some guy who wanted to operate on a 70-year-old girl's eye when it was perfectly healthy, that would be a story that you would tell, at cocktail parties to other ophthalmologists, which means that your reputation in the neighborhood where you are being referred patients from is going down the toilet. So less referrals means less business. So while all of these problems are ethical problems, they're having a real business impact on your business. So that's why we think it's a business ethics issue.
Okay, thank you.
A question I have, I heard the solution of settling quickly and quietly, and I understand that, but I also wonder, the word is out there in the community that this business and this practice has problems, and I wonder, are there any other recommendations about damage control and trying to help the reputation of the company, of the practice, by making some sort of public statements or some sort of external expression of a commitment to this new culture that you're recommending?
Yeah, I mean, to mitigate damages that might occur, I mean, also with the settling quickly and quietly, I think another one I mentioned was for the to review all the charts. So that also, I mean, go with that and review all the charts and see if any other patients require compensation. But I mean, as far as firing Dr. Kavanaugh and putting an ethical leader in place, I mean, I think that's a good move, and the public will see that and see that that's been taken care of. And as far as headlines and stuff like that, then just try to keep, that quiet as possible, and maybe issue a statement that Emory has taken a step towards fixing this issue, and they have fired the guy that they put in that position and hired a new one.
Also, too, as a society, I think it's easier if we accept the fact that something went wrong, acknowledge that, and then you can move forward. So by removing Dr. Kavanaugh, replacing him with an ethical leader, kind of shows a changing of the guard that we've accepted responsibility for his actions. We'll get him help, professional help if need be, but we need to move the operation in a better direction.
I'd like to add to that, in terms of just picking out Dr. Kavanaugh as the bad apple, I mean, like as I mentioned earlier, we should also change the culture because we have these followers who believe in this guy. So,
And an administration that allows all of this to happen.
So do you want the university to step in and solve this problem, or are you hoping one day that the eye clinic, do you want them to take more responsibility? Because then you're going to have competing interests. If you tell the university to fix it, that just changes the balance of power. Because it seemed like this was a very powerful part, the eye clinic. Obviously there was a lot of greed. So who do you think should fix the problem? But I do like the culture. I want to say this. I think the culture argument or the advice or the suggestion, it should, you should start with, it is a cultural change, but that is very hard to bring about. And it starts at a higher level and it flows down. So who do you think should really take responsibility for fixing it? Because there's a problem, obviously.
I believe that every physician should take the responsibility. That ultimately it's going to come back on the whole medical community, and they all have a duty. Actually, that's in the Hippocratic Oath, that if they see other physicians doing things that aren't right, they have a duty to report that, and so they should be involved. And it is a culture thing, and it's a culture for the entire medical community, not just Emory.
And just to add to what he was saying, ethics is something that the earlier it's taught, the more likely it is to stick to you. And as an intern or resident, you're usually rotating specialties. So it kind of has to be a hospital-wide, maybe not a university-wide, but a hospital-wide initiative, because you can't isolate that just to the eye clinic. And the reason why I think the eye clinic was such a big deal at that time was because of Dr. Kavanaugh, because he was this hotshot, world-renowned eye surgeon that was there and making all this money and growing. But it's just, it's another part of the Emory Clinic, which has many different parts. So I think if the ethics, what we recommend is that the ethics are tied, not just just taught, they're actually tied to progress. So if you're progressing from being an intern to a resident, part of that progression has to be, are you an ethical person? Just like they judge you in bedside manner, they judge you in how well you can diagnose someone. Someone needs to be there, probably your attending, or whoever is your direct supervisor, needs to know to judge you on your ethical behavior. So that's why we feel like it has to be a hospital-wide initiative.
I'm going to ask this question as a member of this committee, realizing that I'm not an attorney. But in your opinion, was there any potential, or is there potential in this case for action under the False Claims Act?
I'm not actually familiar with that. Could you give me some background on what that act is?
Do any of the other?
Is anyone familiar with the False Claims Act? No, I'm not really familiar with that. I'm sorry.
Did Dr. Kavanaugh's clinic submit any business to Medicare patients?
Yes.
They received government?
Yes.
Yes, there was actually a lot of Medicare fraud. He routinely billed for surgeries that weren't performed. Usually when you're doing an operation and you're doing 2 or 3 different parts, you don't bill them all separately. You bill them all as one procedure, and then you get paid part of the other procedures. So he would bill all these procedures separately, so he would get the full payment for all 3 procedures. He also said that there were full surgeons in the operating room when all there were was interns or residents. So there was plenty of Medicare fraud. So if that is what that act applies to, I believe that he would definitely be convicted under it.
I'd like to also add to that. And back in the 80s, corneal transplants were pretty much new. I mean, today it's common. So back then, when residents helped Dr. Kavanaugh conduct these corneal transplants, I mean, they weren't even supposed to be in the room. It was just supposed to be the doctors only.
Just another comment, and thank you, I appreciate that. In reference to my colleague's discussion earlier about settling claims quickly and quietly as part of the landscape of how to deal with these kinds of issues going forward. You mentioned organizational justice, and I think of that sometimes in terms of procedural justice. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with the term procedural justice? Mm-hmm. How would you describe procedural justice? Just kind of in a nutshell.
Basically, you just have fair and open procedures that are just for every employee, but they're not biased to different. I mean, different people in the company.
Well,
All of the employees feel heard, and they feel that any issues that they might have been taken care of, and that the policies that are in place, they're equal for everybody, that there's not somebody who's getting special treatment through these policies. I think fairness is definitely the word that comes to mind when I think of procedural justice.
And so my question, I think, is related to, is settling, and I'm not disagreeing with you about settling things quickly, certainly, and perhaps quietly, although does procedural justice in terms of openness and fairness of procedures allow for doing things quietly and under
Well,
the
I
radar screen?
mean, there's a difference between doing things quietly publicly and doing things quietly internally. You can make a huge stink internally if something goes wrong. I feel like you should, but I don't think that they would have gotten the same. You guys would have gotten the same headlines that you did if it wasn't for the fact that there was a cover-up. And also, as we mentioned, the cover-up elongated the process a lot. So instead of having those bad headlines for a year or two, it was for 14 years because the lawsuits just kept going on, and then we wouldn't admit culpability.
I mean, and Emory is a great institution. They have a lot of great doctors there, and settling quietly, I mean, that prevents any pain that's going to be caused to them from these issues. So, I mean, that's just the best case to move forward.
Any other questions?
We've asked you, as a consulting team, to give us your opinion. Do you think that this problem within the clinic is something that would serve as a lesson for the entire university? In other words, are we just referring to the clinic, the eye clinic? Are we just referring to the hospital? Or are we referring to the entire university? And have you thought about that in your consulting discussions?
There were definitely reverberations throughout the university. It was something like this, because of the sensational nature of it, tends to spread. And when something like this spreads, the panic about it spreads too. So I think the overhaul has to be somewhat university-wide.
You have to have buy-in from the top, because if you want to implement these type of operations, and essentially a CEO is going to say, no, I'm going to pass on the ethical meeting, I've got to go play golf this afternoon, it's not important to me. Well, then you're setting an example to your subordinates that this is not going to be that important down the line when I further my advancement in career. So I think you have to set a priority that from top down, that ethical issues that happen at the university or the eye clinic are a priority, and you have to deal with them with that knowledge.
Have you all talked to the president of Emory about this? Did you interview him in your thinking?
No.
Who did you interview in terms of coming up with your conclusions?
Yeah, so we actually, the author of the book that the case is on, we interviewed with him. We did not have an opportunity to interview with the leader, but we feel that because there's some tying with the medical and the university, that just because this event just was in the eye area, that there was the case where you could make that we should have probably reached out to the leader, but internally we could have...
The leader being the president?
Yes, being the president. There was ways that, as small as this basically a small business unit was, they could have improved the status by getting rid of Dr. Kavanaugh. And our researchers felt that by implementing this new organizational justice, that it could have improved right away by implementing the ethics decisions that we laid out to you guys.
Tom Hardin, the author of Waking Up Blind, whose book we based most of our research on, he talked to Drs. Campbell and Gammon, the whistleblowers. He talked to most of the faculty that was there. He talked to the patients, he talked to the lawyers of Sergeant Houston. So and a lot of the information that we got was gathered from that source. We got information from a lot of different people, not the president of the university. I don't think he had the opportunity to talk to him either. I don't think they were making any comments about that at the time. But we talked to a few different people. And then we also consulted one of the lawyers from Emory University while we were doing our presentation. So we just didn't get to talk to anyone either, so.
One of the things that you did not touch on, and it's not a surprise to me because a lot of times this was kind of absent in conversations about these kinds of cases, is governance, oversight. So here's a relationship between this and this Dr. Kavanaugh, who is the chairman of this ophthalmology clinic. It was the University Ophthalmology Clinic. Were you able to see whether there was any reporting relationship or responsibilities with the Board of Trustees? Was there any kind of governance body that provided some balance of controls? I think there are some structural issues besides procedural ones in terms of governance that would be useful to think about in terms of this case. Do you have any comments with regard to governance?
As far as the peer review process, that's what they had in place to investigate everything, and adding an ethics component to that might help out the structure a little bit, and I think that's one of our recommendations also.
So what happened was there was an investigation committee which met for about a year and did basically nothing. They came up with, their conclusion was that Dr. Kavanaugh's behavior was not unethical. That was in fact the whistleblowers who were making too much of a sting, and they're the ones who should be kicked out. So you were right, there is definitely a problem with governance because there really wasn't any over Dr. Kavanaugh. Part of that was because he, again, was this hotshot doctor who was raising millions and millions of dollars, so they didn't want to mess with it. And he had a great reputation. He had really close relationships with the leadership. So even if there was a governance in place, it wasn't very effective. So that's definitely one of the recommendations that we feel like you should look at.
And we did have an interview with a VP at the Piedmont Hospital, which is a local hospital, who was I guess hospital director at the time when Dr. Kavanaugh was practicing at the Emory Eye Clinic. And we asked about how they build their board of directors, and she's mentioned that during then they used more internal members, so they would just use their physicians to be on the board, and they would use the only external members that they would use would be powerful attorneys that they would use just to protect their brand image.
I have a question. Obviously, this doesn't just happen at this university. I mean, it happens with college football coaches, and you hear the same, different players, but the same story. So why do you think? I mean, this is really, you've studied the case. I mean, you've read all the facts. You've talked to the people. Because after you hear it, sitting here, it seems okay. Well, of course we should do all this, or of course they should have been doing, different things or making different decisions, or how can this have happened? So how does this happen? I mean, because I sit here, hindsight's 20/20, and you think, how can something like this happen, especially in today? And how could they not have all these programs or in place? But what does your gut tell you? Why does this happen in different scenarios?
I think greed, first of all, and not greed necessarily for money, but greed for power. Greed for money for the institution, greed for power for this, one central figure, whoever it is, if it's a coach or a doctor or whatever it is. And then that's sort of like, when someone's really good, there's that tendency to blind yourself to their faults, to everything else that's wrong about them, because they're, doing that one thing really well, much better than everybody else. So they're, like she said, their irrational behavior is often excused because they're making a lot of money for you.
And just to add to that, Dr. Kavanaugh, he was very intelligent. He had dual degrees, a PhD and an MD, and he was likable. He just kind of got in there and made everybody like him and just kind of rose up to the top like that. And in hindsight, he didn't use his power in the right ways, and he didn't care about people.
And our impression of the culture is that it was very cult-like. Like everybody was sort of enamored with this, articulate, charismatic, charming Dr. Kavanaugh, and kind of followed blindly.
But they knew there was a risk. At some point, they knew there was a risk. So you think they just decided, what, we'll play the odds, we'll,
I think
the benefits outweigh the risk? I mean, is that what it came down to, that
That,
make
and I
this
think
look good?
the psychological aspect of it is just like you feel like, well, if everybody else is doing it here, it's probably okay. Yeah, if something happens, you know, Emory will cover my back because that's what they wanted me to do in the first place. There's that like sort of psychological aspect to it too.
And I mean, Dr. Kavanaugh, I mean, even when he knew he operated on the wrong eye, he went and took a long vacation just for his peace and sanity. So I mean, it shows that, you know, he's just kind of letting it slide, but it's still in his mind when he's on vacation, he's thinking that he's still going to his clinic. And it's not just the universities, and he wants to walk out with his name on it.
And that was the strange part. He left a note saying, I feel like I'm going crazy. I need to go on vacation to calm myself down. And he actually publicly said this to the hospital administration. I didn't think that was a problem.
And also, he was one of the top ophthalmologists in the country. And I mean, he had friends in high places, and they all thought that I mean, I guess they thought they continued to get away with it.
I mean, he was stressed out because, I mean, he did even tell his peers that, you know, the man in the net's going to come and get me eventually, but he still, to this day, he would let it slide.
Well, thank you very much. We have a few minutes for some feedback from the judges. Who would like to comment on any of what you've heard this morning?
I would like to comment, first of all, in terms of process. I thought you all were very poised and made eye contact. Your presentation style, I think, was uniformly very good. And I liked the way you started off with a story. That's very powerful in almost any type of audience, the ability to tell a story and to tap into emotion. And those were two elements that, in terms of just process, that I wanted to comment on.
I like the use of statistics and analysis, how you backed up your assertions with numbers, talking about the misdiagnosis rate of 10% and how, most surgeons, it's less than that, or 5%.
It's about 3.4 for most surgeons.
Yeah,
it's, it's more than 3 times.
Those kinds of things really help to bolster an argument, and I thought that was very persuasive.
I think I'll do a good job. Very poised. I have to agree with the comments, the first comments. And it's not difficult. I mean, I know how hard it is to be up in front of people and speak, believe me, and I did a very good job. I actually thought you did a better job with the questions and answers. I could tell, I know you've been probably writing what you wanted to say and very scripted, but I thought you translated that well. And don't be afraid to, it doesn't have to be so rehearsed. When you speak, it's sometimes best to, yes, put your thoughts together. And let me say this, I always, bucked having to do the outline. But it's better to do an outline than to write everything out, because you do, it just seems to flow. So I thought you did a really good job with the questions and answers, because it couldn't script it. And about telling the story, because we have to do a lot of PowerPoints and presentations, and even in court. And it is really good to tell a story. And if you can get more than one emotion, you can get people angry, you can get people, indignant or upset, and then, or just that whole range of emotions. It does tend to draw people in. So I think they'll do a good job. Yeah, good job. Yeah.
I thought that I would recommend maybe at the end, AJ, a summary slide, because this slide was stuck up there when you were still doing the summary, and I think just with the big bullets in terms of the broad areas that you talked about, and also I think it's kind of, I thought a lot of your recommendations were very tactical and granular, I do think it's kind of useful to step back sometimes and take the 20,000-foot view, okay? That what are the big areas that are really involved here? There are governance issues here, there's oversight, you know, there's audit type of issues, there are reporting issues, and so maybe rather than diving into the granular level, at least at first talking about these are the big buckets that are part of this landscape.
Yeah, one thing, you talked about the investment. I made a note about that. You never really followed up with that. That's something that you made a $12 million investment. Just me personally, I'm kind of curious. Okay, obviously you're going to recommend that, you know, the doctors don't personally invest in the business, but kind of what happened with, I don't know, I'm just kind of sitting here
He
thinking.
just donated $12 million.
He donated, okay.
Yeah, he basically wanted his name on it.
Yeah,
At the end of the
I was
day.
kind of curious about that.
I concur with the comments. Good job. You all clearly were prepared. If I had one, however, I'd probably talk about setting the stage for the case a little better. For example, I wasn't sure who I was. In other words, I know I was a part of the Professional Ethics and Standards Committee, but was that a committee of the hospital?
Physicians.
Was it a committee of just the clinic? Was it a committee of the entire university? Because the hospital is a part of the university and is answerable to the university. So, as a consulting group, did we, as a Professional Ethics and Standards Committee, contract you to bring us a recommendation that we might then take to whom? The president of the hospital, or whatever his title or her title is, to the eye clinic alone, or to the president of the university. This goes back to what Ernie was saying in terms of the whole governance structure here, but I'm trying to talk also about setting the stage for the case, okay? This was a case that goes back into the 80s, correct? So even setting the stage in terms of, is it, you know, bringing it into a present moment. You know, are we a committee back in 1987? Are we a committee today? Are we reflecting upon what happened back in the 80s and trying to apply it to setting up something for today? You see what I mean? So I had a little bit of an identity crisis, which I think I always have here and there. And I didn't quite know who I was on this committee or what my responsibilities, to whom my responsibilities are directed. Okay, I thought that could have been done a little better. But I think you had, I liked what Ernie said in terms of the granular aspects of setting, just like what's up on this slide. You know, here are the pieces, here are some of the pieces that are necessary in changing a very important point that you made, the culture of at least the hospital or the clinic, but we also then begin to talk about the entire university, of which it's a part, right? You need ethics training, you need a committee, a compliance and ethics committee, you need to do surveys, you need to have input from employees and staff and faculty of the code of ethics. You need to have an internal reporting system or some kind of reporting system like these whistleblowers may or may not have had. They certainly didn't seem to get a very fair hearing. So I thought I mean, I really liked that part, you know, because it crisped up your presentation so that I could begin to see some of the recommendations you were making as a consulting committee.
Any other comments or reflections from the judges?
I have some, sorry, we do have some handouts for you too.
Okay.
I think we can include you all with that if there's anything else that you need from us.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your time.
Well, we want to thank you and give you a round of applause. Good job. Very nicely done. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, good job.
It's good to go first, huh?
Yeah.